There is a molecule your brain produces naturally. Not a synthetic chemical, not something cooked up in a lab, something your own body makes. It's called dimethyltryptamine, DMT. And when people consume concentrated forms of it, they report experiences that are so consistently strange, so uniformly unlike anything else, that the sheer repetition of the descriptions across thousands of unconnected people starts to become genuinely difficult to explain away. People meet entities, not vague shapes, not blurry impressions, specific, intelligent, communicative beings that seem to exist in a place that feels more real than ordinary reality, beings that appear to have been waiting, that have things to show you, that seem to know you in some way you can't account for. And this happens to people across cultures, across centuries, across every demographic. The retired accountant and the indigenous shaman and the neuroscientist describe encounters that rhyme with each other in ways that are hard to chalk up to coincidence. Rick Strassman was a psychiatrist at the University of New Mexico who in the early 90s got the first government-approved license to study psychedelics in humans. In over 2 decades, he injected 60 volunteers with DMT intravenously and documented what happened. What he expected was interesting psychological experiences, hallucinations, altered states, the kind of thing you can fit into existing frameworks. What he got was something harder to file away. Over and over, subjects reported leaving their bodies and entering a space that felt like another dimension. Not a dream space, not a vague, altered state, a place with architecture, with inhabitants, beings that noticed them arriving, that communicated, that performed things on them, examined them, showed them things. One subject described it as more real than this room, more real than his own hands. Like ordinary life was the pale version, and this was the actual thing. Strassman eventually published his findings in a book called DMT, the Spirit Molecule. He had no clean explanation. He still doesn't. He ended up developing a hypothesis that DMT might be involved in the transition between life and death, that the brain releases it at birth and at death, and possibly during deep sleep, that the entities might not be hallucinations in the conventional sense. That is not the conclusion of a reckless person. That is a careful academic researcher saying, I ran the study and I cannot account for what I found. The entity encounter thing is what gets me, because hallucinations are supposed to be personal. They're supposed to reflect the content of your own mind, your memories, your fears, your desires. But these beings don't feel like projections. They feel autonomous. They have their own agenda. They're surprised to see you or they're expecting you. They communicate things the person didn't know and couldn't have generated from their own psychology. Some researchers have started using the language of transpersonal experience, meaning experiences that seem to originate outside the individual self, which is either a genuine phenomenon that doesn't fit our current understanding of consciousness, or it's a very specific kind of extremely convincing hallucination that shares structural similarities across thousands of unrelated people. Neither option is boring. The neuroscience angle is interesting too. DMT binds to serotonin receptors, which is what most psychedelics do, but it also binds to signal 1 receptors, which are found in high concentrations in the brain's stress response systems. And there's some evidence that the brain upregulates DMT production under extreme conditions, near death, extreme trauma, sensory deprivation. Which raises an obvious question: why would the brain have this molecule? What is it for? One hypothesis is that it's a protective mechanism, that under conditions of extreme stress or dying, the brain floods itself with DMT to produce an experience that makes the process survivable or even meaningful, the light at the end of the tunnel, the feeling of presence, the sense of being welcome somewhere. Which would mean that near-death experiences and DMT entity encounters are related phenomena, which would mean the dying brain is generating something very specific, very consistent, for reasons we don't understand. That's not nothing. That deserves more than a footnote. Terence McKenna spent decades talking about DMT, and his descriptions are worth sitting with, regardless of what you make of his broader theories. He said the entities communicated in a way that was partly language and partly something else entirely. That they would show you objects that were impossible, things that were somehow self-explanatory, that contained meaning you could apprehend but not translate back into ordinary language. He called them self-transforming machine elves, which is a phrase that sounds ridiculous until you hear enough other people independently describe almost exactly the same thing without having read Terence McKenna. The convergence is the part that won't let go of me. You can dismiss one account, you can dismiss 100. At some point, the consistency starts to feel like data. I'm not telling you what to believe about any of this. I genuinely don't know what's happening when someone smokes DMT and meets an entity. I don't think anyone does. The honest position is that something very unusual is occurring in the human nervous system under these conditions, and we don't have a framework that cleanly contains it. What I find interesting is that the experience almost universally produces a specific effect on people afterward. A sense that something real happened, a reduced fear of death, a feeling that consciousness is larger and stranger than ordinary life suggests, an inability to be as confident as you were before that you know what's going on. That last one might be the most valuable thing. Let that sit as you fall asleep. Somewhere in the chemistry of your own brain is a molecule that might be responsible for the most extreme experiences humans ever report. Your brain makes it right now while you're lying here. It exists in you in trace amounts, doing whatever it does. The territory inside your own skull is stranger than most maps suggest. You don't have to go anywhere to find the mystery. It's already in there. Quiet now, but in there. The thing people always say when they hear about someone joining a cult is, how could they be so stupid? And that reaction, that immediate dismissal, is exactly what makes people vulnerable. Because the research on who joins cults is pretty clear. It's not about intelligence, it's not about education, it's not about being broken or desperate or naive in some obvious way. It's about being human. The techniques that cults use to recruit and retain members work on human psychology at a level that bypasses conscious reasoning. They're not fooling people, they're exploiting the same mechanisms that make you trust your friends, feel connected to a group, seek meaning, and want to be loved. The machinery they're hacking is the same machinery that holds civilization together. That's what makes it scary. Robert Cialdini spent decades studying influence and persuasion. His work on compliance techniques, the psychological principles that make people say yes, became foundational to understanding not just sales and marketing, but manipulation at its most sophisticated. Cults use almost all of them simultaneously over extended periods with deliberate escalation. It starts with love bombing. You meet these people, and they are the warmest, most interested, most attentive humans you have ever encountered. They remember your name. They ask about your life. They make you feel genuinely seen in a way that most of your ordinary relationships don't. You leave the first meeting thinking, these are the most genuine people I've ever met. That feeling is manufactured not by cynical people cackling behind closed doors, often by true believers who were themselves love-bombed and are now passing it forward. Sincerely, the manipulation can be completely authentic on the individual level while being structurally engineered at the organizational level. Isolation comes next. Gradually, you spend more time with the group. The group's explanations for the world become more familiar than outside explanations. Outside relationships start to seem less nourishing by comparison, partly because ordinary relationships don't involve the constant, intense attention and validation the group provides. You're not dragged away from your outside life. You drift away from it because the group keeps being more compelling. By the time isolation is significant, you've also accumulated what researchers call sunk cost investment. You've given time, money, social capital. You've told people about this group. You've defended it. Leaving means admitting you were wrong about something you went public with. That psychological cost is enormous, and most people would rather adjust their beliefs than face it. The thought-stopping techniques are what really lock it in. Every high-control group has them. Phrases, practices, mental habits that interrupt critical thinking at exactly the moment it would be most threatening to the group's control. You have a doubt, and immediately you're supposed to pray or chant or recite something or tell a leader about the doubt, which then becomes a confession that can be used against you later. The doubt never gets examined. It gets extinguished over and over until the habit of extinguishing doubt becomes automatic. That process is not unique to cults. It's a more extreme version of how any belief system maintains itself against challenge. The cult version is just more deliberate and more total. Stephen Hassan was in the Moonies for years, recruited at college when he was going through a hard time. His girlfriend had just broken up with him. He was feeling lost. A group of friendly people invited him to dinner. The dinner led to a weekend retreat. The weekend retreat led to him dropping out of college and working 18-hour days fundraising for Sun Myung Moon. He eventually got out. His family staged what was essentially an intervention, and he spent the next several decades studying the psychology of undue influence and helping people leave high control groups. What he describes about his time inside is this: he was never fully himself. There was a cult self that operated on the surface, following the rules, performing the belief, and underneath there was a suppressed, authentic self that had doubts and questions, and a life it had abandoned. The cult self didn't know about the authentic self. That's how total the compartmentalization was. Getting out meant reintegrating those two selves, which took years. The BITE model is what Hassan developed: behavior control, information control, thought control, emotional control, rate. Any group on those 4 dimensions, and you can measure how controlling it actually is regardless of what it claims to be. Scenario behavior control. Does the group regulate what you eat, where, who you associate with, how you spend your time? Information control. Does the group discourage or prohibit access to outside information, particularly critical information about the group itself? Thought control. Does the group provide loaded language, thought-stopping techniques, black and white thinking frameworks? Emotional control. Does the group manipulate emotions through guilt, fear, love, withdrawal, us versus them dynamics? Most high control groups score high on all 4. The degree varies. Some are more controlling than others, but the pattern is consistent across groups that have nothing else in common: different theologies, different politics, different aesthetics, because the pattern isn't about beliefs, it's about control. What I find most important about understanding this is that it removes the smugness from the reaction. The "how could they be so stupid" response is not just wrong, it's dangerous, because it prevents people from recognizing the same dynamics operating in less extreme forms in groups they belong to. Every human being is susceptible to belonging to, meaning, to the comfort of having all the questions answered, to a leader who seems to have figured something out. The question isn't whether you're immune. Nobody is immune. The question is whether, how to recognize the patterns. Think about that as you settle in. The need to belong is not a weakness. It's one of the deepest things about being human. Hundreds of thousands of years of evolution shaped you to find your tribe and stay with it. That instinct kept your ancestors alive. It just needs to be pointed at something real, something that doesn't need to control you to keep you. Rest now. You already belong somewhere. Right here. Something changed in 2017. For decades, the official position of every government on Earth was essentially the same. There's nothing to see here. People who report unusual things in the sky are mistaken or confused or attention-seeking. The subject is not worthy of serious investigation. Move along. And then the New York Times published a story that broke that posture completely. The Pentagon had a secret program. It was called the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. It ran from 2007 to 2012 with $55 million in funding, quietly buried in defense appropriations bills by a senator from Nevada named Harry Reid. The program was run out of a small office in the Pentagon, and it investigated reports of unidentified aerial phenomena from military personnel. And alongside that story, the Times published videos, gun camera footage from Navy F-18s showing objects that moved in ways that defied easy explanation. The Tic Tac video, the gimbal video, the Go Fast video, declassified and released, and suddenly sitting on the front page of the most credible newspaper in the world. That was not a small thing. Commander David Fravor was one of the pilots who encountered the Tic Tac object off the coast of San Diego in 2004. He has told the story dozens of times now, and the details don't change. He was flying a training exercise when controllers directed him toward an anomalous contact that had been tracked on radar for 2 weeks. The object was descending from 80,000 feet to 20,000 feet and then back up repeatedly. No aircraft does that. When Fravor visually acquired the object, he described a white pill-shaped craft about the size of his F-18 with no wings, no exhaust, no visible means of propulsion. He began a circular descent toward it. The object mirrored his movement. Then in the time it took him to complete the turn, it was gone. Just gone. And then it showed up on radar at a rendezvous point that had been designated in the pre-flight briefing, a point that was 60 miles away, essentially instantaneously. Fravor is a decorated Navy commander with 18 years of flying experience. He is not a UFO enthusiast. He went on record because he said what he saw deserved an explanation and nobody had given him one. The language shift is interesting. The government stopped saying UFO and started saying UAP. Unidentified aerial phenomena. The cynical reading is that it's just rebranding, same subject, new acronym designed to make it sound more serious and less tinfoil hat. But the actual shift in posture has been real. In 2020, the Pentagon officially released the 3 Navy videos and acknowledged they were genuine. In 2021, the Director of National Intelligence released a report on UAPs that acknowledged 144 incidents that couldn't be explained. In 2022, NASA formed a study group. In 2023, congressional hearings were held where military witnesses testified under oath about retrieved non-human craft and biological material. That last one is worth sitting with military officers under oath in front of Congress, testifying that the United States government has recovered craft of non-human origin. That is not a Reddit post. That is not a guy with a website. That is sworn congressional testimony. David Grush is the name attached to the most significant claims. He's a former intelligence officer who served as the National Reconnaissance Office's representative to the UAP task force. In 2023, he went to Congress and said that the United States has been running a secret program for decades to retrieve and reverse engineer non-human craft. That this program operates outside of congressional oversight. The people who tried to come forward about it were threatened and in some cases harmed. He said he had not personally seen the craft. He was reporting what he had been told by dozens of people with direct knowledge over years of investigation. The government's response was not to call him crazy. It was to say his claims could not be verified, which is a notably different thing. The physics of what's been observed is what makes the subject hard to dismiss, even for skeptics who really want to. The objects in the Navy footage demonstrate what the government's own analysts described as 5 observables. Instantaneous acceleration, hypersonic velocity without signatures, meaning no sonic boom, no heat bloom, no exhaust, low observability. They don't show up on radar consistently despite being visible optically, trans-medium travel, moving between air and water without slowing down. Anti-gravity lift, no visible means of staying aloft. No known human technology does all 5 of those things, not even close. The most advanced aircraft in existence can't do any of them. Which means whatever these things are, they're either human technology so classified that the Navy pilots encountering them weren't briefed, which would be an extraordinary failure of military coordination, or there's something else. I'm not telling you aliens are real. I genuinely don't know. Nobody outside of whatever programs may or may not exist knows. What I'm saying is that the official position has shifted enough that the dismissive response is no longer intellectually honest. Something is in the airspace. The military knows it, the government acknowledges it, the physics doesn't fit anything we build. What it actually is remains genuinely open. And I find that one of the most interesting open questions there is, because the range of possible answers from classified human technology to something genuinely non-human, every answer on that spectrum is a big deal. Let that sit with you as you go under. Somewhere up there, above the atmosphere, beyond the thin shell of air that keeps you alive, there's a lot of space, an incomprehensible amount of it. We've barely left. Whatever is or isn't out there, you're on a small warm planet doing a completely ordinary thing. Breathing, resting, the sky doing whatever the sky does above you. You don't need to figure it out tonight. Nobody has yet. A grizzly bear can smell you from 18 miles away. Not a few miles, 18 miles. Their sense of smell is 7 times stronger than a bloodhound, and a bloodhound can track a scent that is 4 days old across miles of terrain. The grizzly is doing something beyond that, something that doesn't have a clean human equivalent because we have no sensory experience that maps onto it. They are reading the world in a way we can't access, and they can run 35 miles an hour, which means if a grizzly decides to close the distance between you and it, the interaction is over before most people have finished processing that it started. Usain Bolt runs 27 miles an hour at his absolute peak for about 10 seconds. A grizzly sustains 35. There's almost no animal encounter in North America that resets your understanding of where humans sit in the food chain faster than a close encounter with a grizzly bear. Doug Peacock spent years alone in grizzly country after coming back from Vietnam. He's written about it, and Werner Herzog made a documentary that touched on his story. What he found out there in the wilderness wasn't just bears, it was something about himself, something about what it meant to be an animal among animals rather than a human standing above nature looking down at it. He describes moments of being watched by bears before he saw them, that prickling awareness that something large was aware of you, the way the forest felt different when a grizzly was nearby, not just frightening, different, like the whole landscape had a different quality of attention in it. He came to believe that proximity to apex predators does something to the human nervous system that nothing else does. That we evolved in environments where being eaten was a real possibility, and something in us recognizes that context and responds to it in ways that feel almost like coming home. That sounds strange, but think about the people who seek out wilderness, who go back again and again to places where they are not the most dangerous thing. There's something being fed in those places that manicured. Safety doesn't touch. The grizzly's relationship with food is almost incomprehensible in scale. Before winter denning, a grizzly needs to consume around 20,000 calories a day. 20,000, a large active human male needs about 3,000. The grizzly is doing something metabolically that we can barely model. They'll eat 400 pounds of food in a single week during hyperphagia, the pre-hibernation feeding frenzy. Berries, roots, ground squirrels, elk calves, spawning salmon. They stand in rivers and catch fish mid-leap with their mouths. An adult grizzly can flip a 300-pound boulder with one paw looking for insects underneath. One paw. And then they walk into a den and their heart rate drops from 40 beats per minute to 8. Their body temperature drops. Their metabolism slows to almost nothing. And they lie there for 5 to 7 months burning stored fat, not eating, not drinking, not urinating. Females give birth during this period to cubs that weigh less than a pound. The physiology of hibernation is something researchers are actively studying for human medical applications. The muscle preservation alone, hibernating bears don't lose muscle mass despite months of inactivity, is something that could potentially be applied to long-term space travel or treating muscle-wasting diseases. The bears solved a problem. We haven't. Timothy Treadwell spent 13 summers living among grizzlies in Alaska. He believed he had developed a special relationship with them, that he was accepted, that the normal rules didn't apply to him. In his 13th summer, a bear killed and partially consumed him and his girlfriend. The story is tragic, and Treadwell clearly had genuine love for the animals, but what happened to him is also a kind of lesson about the difference between projection and reality. He saw what he wanted to see: reciprocal relationship, mutual recognition, acceptance. The bears were doing what bears do. They were being bears. They weren't in a relationship with him. They were apex predators operating on instinct and opportunity. The wilderness doesn't care about your narrative about it. That's not a dark thought. It's actually a clarifying one. There are about 50,000 grizzlies left in North America, most of them in Alaska and Canada in the lower 48. There are maybe 2,000 scattered across Wyoming, Montana, Idaho. They were hunted to near extinction and have been slowly recovering under protection. What their presence does to an ecosystem is remarkable. The areas where grizzlies are active show measurably different vegetation patterns, different river structures, different animal population distributions, not just because of what they eat, because of how everything else behaves when they're around. Elk don't graze the same way when grizzlies are present. They move more. They don't linger in valleys. And that movement changes which plants get eaten and which don't, which changes erosion patterns, which changes rivers. A single apex predator restructures the entire ecosystem below it just by existing. That's called the ecology of fear. And it means that removing a top predator doesn't just remove that animal. It unravels relationships that took thousands of years to build. There is something about knowing that large predators exist somewhere on this planet that I find genuinely comforting. Not because I want to be eaten, but because it means the world is still wild in places, that there are forests where the rules are different, where you're not automatically at the top. That keeps something honest. The grizzly doesn't know about stock markets or phone notifications or any of the things that feel so urgent in daily life. It's out there right now in the dark somewhere, moving through old growth, reading the world through its nose, doing exactly what it was built to do. No confusion about it. Just the dark and the forest and the work of being alive, which is all any of us are really doing, just with more noise around it. Let the noise go quiet now. Just the breathing, just this. There is a depression treatment that works in hours. Not weeks, not months, not the 6 to 8 weeks your doctor tells you to wait before evaluating whether your antidepressant is doing anything. Hours, a single session. And the effects in some studies last months or years from one experience. It's psilocybin, the active compound in magic mushrooms, and the clinical results coming out of Johns Hopkins and NYU and Imperial College London are some of the most striking findings in psychiatry in decades. Not because they're surprising to anyone who has paid attention to the history of psychedelic research, but because they're surprising to a medical establishment that spent 50 years pretending this line of inquiry didn't exist. The default mode network is the part of your brain most active when you're not doing anything in particular, when you're daydreaming, ruminating, thinking about yourself, replaying conversations, worrying about the future. It's the network most associated with the narrative self, the story you tell about who you are, what's wrong with your life, what you're afraid of. In depression, that network becomes overactive and rigid. The same grooves get worn deeper, the same thoughts loop, the same self-critical narratives replay without resolution. It's like a record that keeps skipping in the same spot. Scenario psilocybin temporarily shuts the default mode network down almost completely. The rigid self-referential loops stop. The normal hierarchy of brain connectivity dissolves. Areas that don't normally communicate directly start talking to each other. The brain becomes, for a period of hours, fundamentally more connected and more flexible than it normally is. And when it comes back online, the grooves are different, the loops have been interrupted, the rigidity has loosened. People describe it as their mind having been cleaned, reset, like furniture that had been fixed in place for years got rearranged. The mystical experience component turns out to be clinically significant, which is a strange sentence to write, but the data supports it. The degree to which someone has what researchers categorize as a complete mystical experience during a psilocybin session, a sense of unity, of sacredness, of encountering something deeply true, of time dissolving, of profound peace, that degree directly predicts therapeutic outcomes. The more complete the mystical experience, the more lasting the benefit. Which means the mechanism of action isn't purely neurochemical in the conventional sense. Something about the experience itself matters. The content of what happens, not just the pharmacology. That's uncomfortable for a materialist framework. It doesn't fit neatly. And the researchers, to their credit, don't try to make it fit neatly. They report what they find. Michael Pollan wrote a book about his own experiences with psychedelics called How to Change Your Mind. He went in as a skeptic, a science journalist with no particular spiritual inclinations and a fair amount of resistance to the whole thing. What he came back with was harder to dismiss than he expected, not because he saw God or dissolved into the universe, though something in that direction happened, but because the experience gave him a genuinely different relationship to his own death, less afraid. Not because he had been told comforting things, but because something in the experience had made the boundary between self and not self feel less absolute, and therefore the prospect of that boundary dissolving permanently felt less catastrophic. He was careful about what he claimed. He didn't say he had proven anything metaphysical. He said something had shifted, and the shift felt real and durable. MDMA is doing something similar for PTSD. Different mechanism, different experience, but the same basic principle, a compound that temporarily changes the brain's operating parameters in ways that allow therapeutic work that is otherwise impossible. The problem with treating PTSD through conventional talk therapy is that trauma memories are stored in the body and the nervous system in ways that get reactivated during discussion. You try to process the memory and the nervous system floods with the same fear response as the original event. You can't think clearly about something your body is convinced is happening right now. MDMA reduces activity in the amygdala, the fear center, while increasing activity in the prefrontal cortex. It also floods the brain with oxytocin, the bonding and trust hormone, so you can access the traumatic memory without the overwhelming fear response. You can look at it from a distance, process it as a memory, rather than reliving it as a present threat. Phase 3 clinical trials have shown remission rates for PTSD that conventional treatments can't touch. Somewhere around 2/3 of participants no longer meet the diagnostic criteria for PTSD after 2 or 3 sessions. 2/3 for a condition that is notoriously resistant to treatment. The war on drugs effectively ended this research for 50 years. Compounds that were showing genuine promise in the 60s got scheduled and locked away, and an entire generation of psychiatry developed without them. The drugs that got approved, SSRIs, benzodiazepines, antipsychotics, work for some people and don't work for others, and the field has been largely stuck for decades. The resumption of this research feels like a door reopening that should never have been closed. What I find most interesting is the consistent theme across all of it. The dissolution of the rigid self, the loosening of the story you're locked into, the temporary removal of the filters and structures that keep consciousness narrow and defended. Every tradition that has gone deep into the nature of mind, Buddhist, Hindu, mystical, Christian, Sufi, arrives at the same place. The self is a construction, it is not the whole of what you are, and loosening your grip on it, even temporarily, changes something. Psychedelics are just a very fast route to a place contemplative traditions have been pointing at for thousands of years. Right now, your own default mode network is quieting down, not from a compound, just from the natural process of sleep approaching, the self-referential loop slowing, the narrative loosening its grip, the brain doing its own version of the reset. Gently, without you having to do anything. Just let the story of today go quiet. It'll be there in the morning if you need it. Right now you don't. There is a man who invented the modern world, and most people couldn't tell you 3 things about him. Not Edison, not Marconi, not any of the names that got the credit and the money and the statues. A Serbian immigrant who died alone and broke in a New York hotel room in 1943, owing 2 months back rent, with a pigeon he loved sitting on his windowsill. Nikola Tesla, the alternating current electrical system that powers every building you have ever been in, the radio, the induction motor, the remote control, fluorescent lighting, the basic principles behind radar, X-ray technology, the electric car, all of it traces back to Tesla, either directly or through work. He pioneered that others built on. And almost none of it made him rich. Almost none of it even carries his name in the public memory. He died having been systematically outmaneuvered, underpaid, and in at least one case deliberately erased by people who understood the value of what he'd created better than they let on. The war of currents is where the story gets interesting. In the 1880s, Edison had built a direct current electrical distribution system across lower Manhattan. It worked, but it had a fatal limitation. DC current couldn't be transmitted more than about a mile before degrading. You'd need a power station every mile to electrify a city. The economics didn't work at scale. Tesla had developed alternating current. AC could be transmitted over hundreds of miles with minimal loss. It was obviously the superior system for large-scale electrification. Edison knew this, and instead of adapting, he launched a public relations campaign to convince the public that AC was dangerous. He electrocuted animals publicly. Dogs, calves, eventually an elephant named Topsy, all killed with AC current to demonstrate its lethality. He lobbied to have AC used in the electric chair so it would be associated with execution in the public mind. It didn't work. AC won because physics won, but the campaign cost Tesla years and resources and left a bitterness that never fully resolved. J.P. Morgan funded Tesla's most ambitious project, a tower on Long Island called Wardenliff. Tesla's stated goal was wireless transmission of electricity, not wireless transmission of information, wireless transmission of actual electrical power. The idea that you could broadcast energy through the Earth and the atmosphere the way you broadcast radio waves and receivers anywhere on Earth could tap into it for free. Free energy for everyone, anywhere? Morgan pulled the funding when he understood the implications. You cannot meter free. You cannot build a business model around a resource that anyone can access from anywhere without paying. Whatever the technical merits of Tesla's vision, the economics were impossible from an investor's perspective. The tower was demolished in 1917. Tesla had never recovered financially. He spent his later years in a hotel, increasingly eccentric, increasingly isolated, feeding pigeons and working on ideas that the scientific establishment had stopped taking seriously. Some of what Tesla claimed toward the end of his life is hard to evaluate. He said he had developed a death ray, a directed energy weapon he called a teleforce device that could destroy aircraft from hundreds of miles away. He offered it to governments. Nobody took him up on it. He claimed to have received radio signals from extraterrestrial intelligence. He claimed to have developed an earthquake machine, a mechanical oscillator that he said he had to destroy with a sledgehammer after it started resonating with the frequency of the buildings around his lab. Are these things true? Some researchers think the earthquake machine story has more substance than it sounds. Resonance is real, and the physics of mechanical oscillators matching structural frequencies is real. The death ray claims are harder to evaluate because the documents were seized by the government when he died, and some of them have never been fully declassified. That last part is just a fact. When Tesla died, the Office of Alien Property seized his papers. Some were eventually returned to his family and are now in a museum in Belgrade. Others went to the FBI and have been partially released under FOIA requests. Whether the released documents represent everything that was taken is unknown. What gets me about Tesla is the specific shape of his failure. It wasn't that his ideas were wrong, it was that they were right in ways that didn't fit the economic structures of his time frame. Wireless energy is genuinely bad for business if your business is selling energy. A system where the infrastructure benefits everyone equally is genuinely threatening if your advantage depends on controlling infrastructure. He wasn't defeated by the laws of physics, he was defeated by the laws of capital. And the people who defeated him made sure the history reflected their version. Edison became the symbol of American invention. Tesla became a footnote. It took a century and an electric car company naming itself after him for most people to learn he existed. There's a version of Tesla's story that's about genius and tragedy and injustice. That version is true and worth knowing. But there's another version that's about how civilization decides what gets developed and what gets buried, what gets funded and what gets defunded, whose name gets attached to discoveries and whose gets quietly removed. Tesla is an extreme example, but the pattern he represents isn't unique to him. A lot of things that could exist don't exist because they can't be monetized. A lot of things that do exist do because they can. That gap between what's possible and what's profitable is one of the most important and least discussed forces shaping the world you live in. Let that drift through your mind as you go to sleep. Somewhere in the history of this electrified world you live in, every light, every socket, every device humming with current, there's a man in a hotel room feeding a pigeon who built most of it and died alone. The world runs on his ideas. It just forgot to tell him, rest now. The current is still flowing. The world record for holding your breath underwater is 24 minutes and 3 seconds. 24 minutes on a single breath while submerged in water. Most people start feeling desperate for air after about a minute. The urge to breathe becomes overwhelming. The body starts sending panic signals. Everything in you says surface now. The people who go beyond that are not doing it through willpower alone. They've trained their physiology to respond differently. They've essentially reprogrammed their body's relationship to oxygen and CO2 and the panic response at a level that most of us never approach. And what they describe in the deep, in the silence, in the pressure, in the blue dark sounds less like athletic competition and more like something else entirely. The mammalian dive reflex is something every human has. When your face contacts cold water, your heart rate automatically drops, blood vessels in your extremities constrict, redirecting blood to your core and your brain. Your spleen contracts and releases a reserve of oxygenated red blood cells into circulation. You don't choose this. It happens automatically. It's a reflex that exists in all mammals and is particularly pronounced in marine mammals like dolphins and seals. In them, it enables dives of extraordinary depth and duration. In humans, it's vestigial, a remnant of something our evolutionary ancestors apparently needed. Free divers trained to amplify it through cold water exposure, through breathing techniques, through years of conditioning. Elite free divers have resting heart rates during dives that drop to as low as 7 beats per minute. The normal resting rate is 60 to 100. 7 beats per minute is a heart that is barely running. And they're fine, swimming conscious, sometimes performing choreographed movements in the dark, hundreds of feet down. Natalia Molchanova was the greatest free diver who ever lived, 41 world records, the first woman to dive below 100 meters on a single breath, a depth where the pressure is 10 times surface pressure and the lungs have compressed to the size of a fist. She described the deep as peaceful in a way the surface never is, that below a certain depth the body stops fighting. The urge to breathe disappears, the mind goes quiet. There's just the blue and the descent and something she described as a complete absence of the mental noise that accompanies ordinary life. She disappeared on a recreational dive in 2015. The body was never found. The ocean that she loved and understood better than almost any human alive just kept her. She was 53 years old. The physics of what happens to a human body at depth is genuinely strange. Around 30 meters, something called blood shift occurs. The lungs have compressed enough that blood plasma begins to fill the air spaces to prevent them from collapsing completely. The chest wall becomes rigid. The body is essentially flooded with fluid to compensate for the pressure. At depth, the free diver becomes negatively buoyant. They stop swimming and simply fall. The body sinking through the water column pulled by gravity with no effort required. Free divers call this the free fall. It's the part they talk about most when they try to describe what the experience is like. Falling through blue silence, heart barely beating, lungs compressed to a fraction of their normal volume, the surface impossibly far above, and somehow calm, somehow the calmest they ever feel. Umberto Pellizzeri is one of the legends of the sport. He described training his mind to be completely present during a dive because any intrusive thought, any anxiety, any future planning, any mental noise increases heart rate and oxygen consumption and shortens the dive. The body in the deep demands complete presence. You cannot be anywhere but here. The past and future are literally too expensive. Every stray thought costs oxygen, which means freediving selects for a mental state that meditation traditions spend years trying to cultivate pure present moment awareness, not as a spiritual achievement, but as a survival requirement. The ocean teaches it faster than any monastery. William Trubridge dives in a place called Dean's Blue Hole in the Bahamas, a circular opening in a shallow lagoon that drops straight down to 202 meters, the deepest known blue hole in the world. The walls go from sunlit turquoise to complete darkness within seconds of descent. He holds the world record for unassisted freediving. No fins, no sled, just a human body pulling itself down and back up by its own effort. Over 100 meters on one breath alone in the dark. He talks about the philosophical dimension of the sport in a way that most athletes don't, about confronting mortality directly, about the moment of decision at the bottom of a dive when the body has almost nothing left and the surface is 100 meters up and you have to trust that what you have in you is enough. He says that moment repeated over years changes how you relate to everything, that having faced the actual limit and come back from it makes ordinary fear feel less substantial, less real. What I find beautiful about freediving is that it requires you to become less tense, less effortful, less noisy inside. The path to the deep is not through force, it's through release. The body knows how to do it. The reflex is already in there, the capacity is already built. The only thing in the way is the panic, the clenching, the insistence on control. Let that go and the body will take you somewhere extraordinary, which is maybe true of more than diving. You're doing a version of this right now. The breath slowing, the heart rate dropping, the body releasing the tension it accumulated during the day. You don't have to go anywhere. You don't have to do anything. Just let the descent happen. The body knows the way down. It's been making this dive every night of your life. Trust it, let go. The pyramids at Giza were built with such precision that the four sides of the Great Pyramid are aligned to the cardinal directions to within 360th of a degree. 360th of a degree, that is an error of less than the width of a human hair across a structure that covers 13 acres and weighs 6 million tons. Modern engineers with laser surveying equipment and GPS have studied this alignment, and the honest ones will tell you they don't fully understand how it was achieved with the tools we assume were available in 2500 BC. Not that it couldn't have been done, but the margin of error is smaller than what most modern construction achieves. Something was going on with those builders, something about their knowledge, their methods, their organization that we haven't fully reconstructed. The standard story of human civilization is linear. Primitive hunter-gatherers gradually develop agriculture, then settlements, then cities, then writing, then complex mathematics and astronomy and architecture. Each step builds on the last the further back you go, the simpler things get. Göbekli Tepe broke that story. 11,000 years old, hunter-gatherers with no agriculture, no pottery, no permanent settlement, building a complex of massive carved stone pillars arranged in precise circles. Some of the carvings are sophisticated enough that archaeologists initially assumed the site was much younger. The dating kept coming back the same 11,000 years. That's 6,000 years before the pyramids, 6,000 years before Stonehenge, before any city we know of, before any civilization in the conventional sense. And whoever built it apparently buried it deliberately. The site was intentionally filled in with rubble around 9,000 years ago. Every section carefully covered, like they wanted to preserve it or hide it. We have no idea who they were. Pumapunku is a site in Bolivia at an altitude of nearly 4,000 meters. The ruins consist of massive stone blocks weighing up to 800 tons, cut with a precision that researchers have compared to machine tooling flat surfaces, right angles, interlocking shapes, drill holes of consistent diameter, H-shaped blocks that fit together like manufactured components. The stone is diorite and granite, among the hardest materials on Earth. The tools we assume were available to the civilization that built it, the Tiwanaku people around 1,500 years ago, were bronze and stone. Bronze cannot cut granite to that tolerance, it physically cannot. There are serious archaeologists who simply don't discuss Pumapunku because they don't have an explanation that fits the timeline and the materials. It gets dismissed as pseudoscience territory because the alternative explanations get weird fast, but dismissing evidence because the explanations are uncomfortable is not science. Something happened there. We don't know what. The Antikythera mechanism was pulled from a shipwreck off the coast of a Greek island in 1901. A corroded lump of bronze gears that sat in a museum for decades before anyone understood what they were looking at. When researchers finally analyzed it properly, they found a device of extraordinary sophistication, an analog computer built around 150 BC, capable of predicting the positions of the sun and moon, tracking the metonic cycle, predicting solar and lunar eclipses, and displaying the 4-year cycle of the ancient Olympic Games. It has 37 interlocking bronze gears. The differential gearing it uses wasn't rediscovered until the 14th century AD. The device is 1,500 years more sophisticated than anything else we have from that period. One mechanism pulled from the ocean that rewrote what we thought we knew about ancient Greek technology. How many others were there that didn't survive? Easter Island, 2,000 miles from the nearest inhabited land, 300 square miles of isolated rock in the middle of the Pacific, and on it nearly 900 massive stone statues called moai. The largest weighs 82 tons, the tallest is 10 meters high, carved from volcanic rock on one side of the island and transported to platforms distributed around the entire coastline. The population that built them is estimated to have peaked at around 15,000 people. The debate about how they were moved has been going on for decades. Experiments with ropes and wooden sledges have shown it's possible, but the logistics at the scale of 900 statues on an island with limited resources and a relatively small population remain genuinely difficult to account for. And then the civilization collapse, deforestation, resource depletion, possibly conflict. The statues that were being transported were abandoned mid-journey. The ones already placed were toppled. Whatever drove the extraordinary effort of building them stopped abruptly and was never resumed. A civilization that built something extraordinary and then destroyed itself before we could ask them why. Graham Hancock has made a career arguing that there was a sophisticated global civilization before the last ice age that was destroyed by cataclysm around 12,000 years ago, that Göbekli Tepe and Pumapunku and the precision of the pyramids are echoes of that civilization passed down through survivors. Mainstream archaeology largely rejects this. The evidence for it is circumstantial, and the gaps in the argument are real. But the anomalies that prompted the theory are real too. The sites that don't fit the timeline, the precision that doesn't match the assumed tools, the sophistication that appears without apparent precursor. The honest position is that our picture of ancient human capability has been wrong before and will probably be wrong again. Let that sit as you drift off. Somewhere on this planet right now, there are stones arranged by human hands that we cannot fully explain, that have been sitting there for thousands of years in silence, patient, not particularly concerned about whether we understand them or not. They were here before your civilization. They'll probably be here after. The mystery doesn't need you to solve it tonight. It's been waiting this long. And then all of a sudden, we have this little scenario. It can wait a little longer. In 1995, wildlife biologists loaded wolves into crates in Canada and drove them south into Wyoming. 14 wolves released into Yellowstone National Park after a 70-year absence. The last wolf in Yellowstone had been killed in 1926 as part of a deliberate government extermination program, 7 decades of the park existing without its apex predator. What happened after the wolves came back is one of the most extraordinary ecological stories of the 20th century, not just because of what the wolves did, but because of what they changed without touching. They changed the rivers. When wolves had been absent for 70 years, the elk population had exploded, not because there were more elk than the land could support in some abstract sense, but because the elk had stopped being afraid without predators. They grazed wherever they wanted. The valleys and riverbanks were particularly attractive, flat, accessible, lush. The elk stood in them for hours, eating everything down to bare soil. The riverbanks eroded, the vegetation disappeared, the rivers widened and shallowed and destabilized without root systems holding the banks together. The waterways shifted and degraded the whole riparian ecosystem. The complex web of life that depends on healthy river edges deteriorated over decades. Then the wolves came back. The elk didn't disappear. The wolf population was small, never more than a few hundred in the park. They couldn't physically eat enough elk to dramatically reduce the population. What they changed was elk behavior. Elk stopped grazing in the open valleys, stopped lingering on the riverbanks, stopped standing in exposed terrain where wolves could see them from a distance and run them down. They moved constantly. They stayed in the forest edges. They grazed quickly and moved on. The valleys the elk abandoned began to regenerate. Willows and aspens and cottonwoods came back. Grasses and wildflowers returned to the riverbanks. Root systems stabilized the soil. The rivers narrowed and deepened and clarified. The physical geography of the park began to change within years of the wolves returning. Beavers came back because the willows came back. Willows are what beavers need to build dams.
Yeah.
The beaver dams created ponds. The ponds created wetland habitat. Otters returned, muskrats returned, ducks and herons and eagles followed. Bear populations increased because the berry bushes came back on the regenerated riverbanks. Ravens and magpies and eagles followed the wolf kills and fed on carcasses. Coyote populations declined because wolves competed with them, which allowed smaller predators like foxes and weasels to thrive, which changed the rodent populations, which changed what hawks and owls ate. The whole system reorganized around the return of one species. This is called a trophic cascade, a change at the top of the food chain that ripples downward through every level of the ecosystem. The wolves didn't just add themselves to the existing system, they restructured it, they restored relationships and pressures and behaviors that had been absent for 70 years, and the land responded. The term for what the wolves did to the elk is the landscape of fear. The mere presence of predators changes prey behavior, even when no predation is occurring. The elk didn't need to actually be eaten to change where they grazed. They needed to believe they might be eaten. That belief, distributed across a population, changed the physical landscape of the park. Fear as an ecological force, shaping rivers, growing forests, creating wetlands. The reintroduction was not without conflict. Ranchers on the park's borders lost livestock to wolves, and some of them lost a great deal. The political fight over the reintroduction was bitter, and in some areas still is. Wolves have been delisted and relisted under the Endangered Species Act multiple times as administrations changed and ranching interests pushed back. The ecological benefits of the reintroduction are not really disputed anymore. The documentation is too thorough. What gets disputed is whether those benefits justify the cost to the people who live alongside the wolves and absorb the losses. That's a genuine tension, not a simple one. The people who lose livestock to wolves are not villains. They're families running operations on thin margins who bear a cost that the rest of us don't pay for, a benefit that the rest of us enjoy. How you resolve that tension says something about what you think wilderness is for and who it belongs to. Rick McIntyre has spent more consecutive days in Yellowstone watching wolves than any other person, thousands of days. He has documented individual wolves, their personalities, their relationships, their histories. He has watched wolves he knew for years live and die. He describes a wolf known as 21 as the greatest wolf he ever observed, a large male who never lost a fight and never killed a defeated rival, who was observed playing with wolf pups that weren't his, who led his pack with what McIntyre describes as a quality that in a human you would call wisdom. I know that's anthropomorphizing. I know the scientists would caution against it. But I also know that the closer researchers look at wolves, the more complex the social and emotional lives they find, the grief when a pack member dies, the play that serves no survival function, the individual personalities that persist across observations over years. Something is going on in there, something that the word animal doesn't quite contain. The wolves are out there right now in Yellowstone in the dark, moving through snow, probably reading the wind, knowing things about their landscape that we'd need instruments to detect. The elk somewhere nearby are aware of them without seeing them. The whole system tuned and alert and alive in ways that 70 years of absence had muted, a balance restored. Not perfect, not static, constantly negotiated between predator and prey and river and forest and weather and time. But alive in a way it wasn't, which is maybe all any ecosystem can ask for, which is maybe all any of us can ask for. Just alive, in balance, for now, rest now. The wolves are doing their part, you do yours. There's a surgeon named Bruce Mosley who performed knee surgery on patients with osteoarthritis. Half the patients got the real surgery, arthroscopic procedure, general anesthetic, the works. The other half got fake surgery. They were put under general anesthetic, given the same incisions, the same sounds, the same recovery protocol. The surgeon went through all the motions. Nothing actually happened to the knee. Both groups reported the same improvement in pain and function. The fake surgery worked as well as the real surgery for a condition that causes genuine structural damage to joint tissue. The placebo was as effective as the procedure that was supposedly treating the underlying physical problem. That study was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, not a fringe publication, the most prestigious medical journal in the world. The placebo effect is usually described as a nuisance in clinical research. The thing you have to control for, the baseline of fake improvement you need your drug to be before it counts as working. It's framed as a contamination of the data rather than a phenomenon in its own right. But when you actually look at what the placebo effect does, it starts to seem like one of the most remarkable and least understood capabilities of the human body. Placebo painkillers trigger the release of endogenous opioids, real ones. Your body manufactures its own morphine-like compounds. In response to the belief that you've taken a painkiller, you can block this effect with naloxone, a drug that blocks opioid receptors, which proves it's a genuine biochemical response, not just a shift in how people report their pain. The belief generates the chemistry, the expectation creates the physical reality. Ted Kapchuk at Harvard has spent his career studying this, and what he's found keeps getting stranger. He ran a study where he told patients explicitly that they were receiving placebos, open-label placebos. The pill bottle said placebo on it. The patients were told these are sugar pills. They have no active ingredient, but research shows they can still be effective. They still work. Patients with irritable bowel syndrome who took open-label placebos, knowing they were taking placebos, showed significantly more improvement than patients who received no treatment. The deception wasn't necessary. Just the ritual of taking a pill in the context of medical care was enough to trigger genuine physiological response. The implication is that part of what makes medicine work has nothing to do with the medicine. The nocebo effect is the dark mirror of this. If the placebo effect is belief making you better, the nocebo effect is belief making you worse. Patients who are told that a treatment has serious side effects experience those side effects at higher rates than patients given the same treatment without the warning, not reported side effects. Measured physiological changes, heart rate, blood pressure, hormone levels. In one study, patients given a sugar pill and told it might cause nausea, experienced nausea at rates comparable to patients given actual chemotherapy drugs. The mind doesn't just generate wellness, it generates illness just as readily. Whatever mechanism is operating here works in both directions with equal efficiency.
Fabrizio Benedetti at the University of Turin has done some of the most rigorous mechanistic work on this. He's identified specific neural pathways, specific neurotransmitters, specific hormonal cascades involved in placebo responses in different conditions.
What he's found is that the placebo effect isn't one thing. It's a family of mechanisms. Different conditions respond to different pathways. Pain responds through opioids. Parkinson's symptoms respond through dopamine. Placebo treatment produces measurable dopamine release in the basal ganglia. Anxiety responds through different mechanisms. Again, the body has multiple systems for generating therapeutic responses in response to expectation and context and ritual, not one, multiple, built in, ready to activate, which raises an obvious question. Why do these systems exist at all? The evolutionary argument is interesting. If the body can generate its own opioids, its own dopamine, its own anti-inflammatory responses in expectation of treatment, why doesn't it just do that all the time? Why does it need the trigger of a pill or a ritual or a white coat? One hypothesis is that these responses are metabolically expensive. The body rations them. It only deploys them when signals from the environment suggest that healing resources are available and the cost is worth paying. The healer, the ritual, the medicine, these are environmental signals that say help has arrived. It is safe to invest in recovery. Which means the relationship between a patient and a healer, the warmth, the attention, the belief in the treatment, the context of care, is not separate from the medicine. It is part of the medicine. It activates biological systems that the compound alone cannot reach. The bedside manner is pharmacologically active. What I find most interesting is what this implies about the relationship between mind and body, the clean separation we inherited from Descartes, the ghost in the machine, the mind up here, and the body down there doesn't survive contact with this data. The mind is not a passenger. It is not watching from above while the biological machinery runs below. It is embedded in the machinery. It is part of the causal chain, what you believe, what you expect, what you feel. These are not just reactions to your physical state. They are inputs into your physical state. The conversation goes both ways. Your body is running its own placebo effect right now, in a sense. The ritual of lying down, the darkness, the quiet, the expectation of sleep. These are signals your nervous system recognizes. They trigger cascades that lower cortisol, drop body temperature, release melatonin, slow the heart. You don't have to manufacture any of this. The context is doing it. The ritual is working. The body knows what's coming, and it's already getting ready. Just let it